The very first railroad in America was not built to carry passengers, and it was not built to carry freight for profit, and it was not built by a great corporation with an eye on the future. It was built to drag rock. Specifically, it was built to haul enormous blocks of granite down off a hill in Quincy, Massachusetts, so those blocks could be floated across the water and stacked, one on top of another, into a tall stone needle on a low rise outside Boston, where, half a century earlier, farmers and militiamen had stood and bled against the finest army in the world. The monument was to the Battle of Bunker Hill. And to build it, a self-taught New England builder named Gridley Bryant had to invent, more or less from scratch, the thing that would become the American Railroad, because there was simply no other way to move that much stone that far. So the ancestor of every freight train and every passenger line that would ever cross this continent was born in 1826 as a granite hauler for a war memorial. That is where I want to begin, because it tells you everything about how this monument was really built. Not by the famous men who spoke at it, but by the practical, forgotten men who had to solve the brute physical problem of moving mountains of rock by hand, and who, in solving it, changed the country far more than the monument itself ever would. The monument is the Bunker Hill Monument, a granite obelisk 221 feet tall, and it took 18 long, troubled years to build, from 1825 to 1843. It nearly failed, more than once, for lack of money, standing half-finished and abandoned for years at a time, while the country that had cheered its cornerstone forgot about it. It was rescued, in the end, not by the great orators whose names are attached to it, but by the fundraising of women and the small donations of working people. And it was raised physically by quarrymen and teamsters and stone setters whose names, almost without exception, are gone, including one man who fell to his death from it and whose name I cannot give you. This is the story of how America built its first great monument to its own revolution, and of the little granite railway and the forgotten hands that actually made it possible. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back. Because the men who solved the real problems of this monument, the ones who moved the stone, are exactly the ones the speeches left out. Let me set the scene, because the emotion that drove this whole enterprise was time running out. On the 17th of June, 1775, on the high ground across the water from Boston, a force of American militia had dug in and faced a frontal assault by British regulars, and though the Americans were finally driven from the hill, they had inflicted such staggering casualties on the attacking British that the battle became a kind of moral victory, proof that the colonists would stand and fight and bleed the empire white. Let me stay on that battle for a moment, because the monument means nothing without it. In the summer of 1775, the revolution had barely begun, and a ragged American army was besieging the British in Boston. To strengthen their position, the Americans moved by night onto the high ground of the Charlestown Peninsula across the water from the city, and dug in, throwing up an earthen redoubt on a hill through the dark hours. When the British saw at dawn what the rebels had done, they resolved to drive them off. And they did it the hard way, by rowing regiments of red-coated regulars across the water and marching them straight up the open hillside into the American guns. The order that came down the American line has become legend, that the men were to hold their fire until they could see the whites of the enemy's eyes, to make every scarce shot count. And they did. Twice the British came up the hill, and twice the American fire tore their ranks apart and sent them reeling back down. It was only on the third assault, when the defenders had run low on powder and ball, that the British finally took the redoubt and the Americans fell back off the hill. So, on paper, the British won. They held the ground at the end of the day. But they had paid a price that staggered them. Over 1,000 of their men killed and wounded, a huge share of the attacking force, including many irreplaceable officers, to take one small hill from a citizen militia. The Americans had lost the position, but proved something far more important, that they would stand against the finest professional army in the world and make it bleed for every step. Among the American dead was Joseph Warren, a beloved young leader of the Revolution who had come to fight as an ordinary volunteer and was killed in the final retreat, a loss that struck the patriot cause hard. That was the meaning of Bunker Hill, And it is why, 50 years on, the memory of it burned so hot that a whole generation felt they could not let it fade without raising something worthy of it in stone. It was one of the founding moments of the revolution. And by the 1820s, half a century later, the men who had fought there were old and dying, and a generation of Americans looked around and realized, with something like panic, that the great deeds of the revolution were passing out of living memory and that the country had built almost nothing to mark them. That anxiety, the fear of forgetting, is worth dwelling on because it is the engine of the whole thing. The generation that launched the monument was the children and grandchildren of the revolution, and they were watching the living link to it die off in front of them. The men who had actually stood on that hill, who had actually seen the British come up the slope, were by the 1820s old men in their 70s and 80s, and every year there were fewer of them. There was a powerful, almost desperate sense that once those men were gone, something irreplaceable would be lost. The direct human memory of the founding, and that a young and fast-changing country, busy getting rich and pushing west, was in danger of simply forgetting what it had been born out of and what it had cost. Building a great monument was a way of fighting that forgetting, of fixing the memory in the most permanent material available so it could not slip away with the last old soldier. It is a little ironic, given how this channel tells these stories, that a monument built specifically to defeat forgetting would itself forget the workers who built it. But that was the driving emotion. To catch the memory of the revolution and hold it in granite before the men who carried it in their own bodies were all in the ground. It is why the cornerstone ceremony was timed to the exact 50th anniversary of the battle, and why it mattered so much that aging veterans and the revolution's living symbol, Lafayette, were there to bless it. They were racing the calendar, trying to build a memory that would outlast the people who remembered. So, a movement rose to build a monument at Bunker Hill, a monument grand enough to match the deed, and to build it while at least some of the men who had been there could still see it. On the 50th anniversary of the battle, the 17th of June, 1825, they laid the cornerstone in front of a crowd, said to number 100,000 people, with 190 aging veterans of the Revolution present, and with the Marquis de Lafayette himself, the great French friend of the Revolution, then on his farewell tour of America, presiding over the ceremony. It was a moment of enormous national feeling, and then the feeling collided with the granite. Because they had decided rightly that a monument to something this important should be built of the most permanent, most serious material there is, solid granite, and granite is one of the hardest and heaviest building stones on Earth. The design that emerged, after a competition and much argument, was a plain, severe, colossal obelisk, over 200 feet of stacked granite, and building it would require thousands of tons of stone to be quarried, shaped, moved, and lifted. The man they put in charge of all of it as architect and superintendent was Solomon Willard, a New England craftsman of extraordinary ability who would become so central to the granite business that he was later called the father of the American granite industry. Willard is worth knowing a little, because he embodies something about how these things really got built. He was not primarily a gentleman architect drawing pretty pictures. He was a craftsman first, a carver and a builder who understood stone from the inside, from the physical work of cutting and shaping it, and who brought that hands-on knowledge to the role of superintendent. When the project needed granite, he did not simply order it from a dealer. He went out himself, on foot, across the New England countryside, examining ledge after ledge, judging the color and the grain and the soundness of the stone, until he found in Quincy what he was looking for. When the project needed the granite worked and moved and set, he involved himself in the practical details of all of it, from the quarrying methods to the tools. He took the job at little or no personal profit, out of dedication to the cause, and he poured years of his life into it. And in the process, by developing the Quincy quarries and the techniques for working their stone, he did as much as any single person to create the American granite industry, which is why he earned that title. He is, in a sense, a bridge figure between the famous men and the forgotten ones, a man whose name we kept, but who kept it by doing the actual practical work of understanding and moving and shaping the stone, rather than by giving speeches. There were more men like Willard than the record shows. He is just the one who rose high enough and stayed close enough to the real work to be remembered for both. And Willard's first great problem was not how to stack the stone. It was how to get it at all, and how on earth to move it. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. Willard searched all over New England for the right granite, walking the countryside himself, examining ledges and outcrops until he found what he wanted in the town of Quincy, south of Boston, where the granite was strong and fine and abundant. The Monument Association bought a quarry there, on a hill that came to be called the Bunker Hill Ledge, to cut their own stone, and by doing so, by quarrying their own granite rather than buying it on the open market, they saved a fortune, something on the order of $60,000, because their own stone cost them a fraction of the market rate. But now, they had a new and enormous problem. The quarry was in Quincy. The monument was to rise in Charlestown, on the far side of Boston, roughly a dozen miles away. And between the two lay the single hardest question of the whole project. How do you move blocks of solid granite, each one weighing several tons, a dozen miles across the countryside in the 1820s, when there was no such thing, anywhere in America, as a railroad? The roads could not do it. A granite block of several tons would sink an ordinary wagon into the dirt and destroy any road it tried to travel, and no team of horses could pull such weights over such distances on the rutted roads of the day. This was the wall the whole project ran into, the same wall that stopped so many great works of that era, the sheer physical difficulty of moving massive weights across land before the machine age. It is genuinely hard, in a world of trucks and cranes, to feel how absolute that barrier was. Weight, in the early 1800s, was a kind of tyranny. A thing that was very heavy was, for practical purposes, very nearly immovable over any distance, because everything that could move it, the horse, the ox, the wagon, the road, had hard physical limits that stone did not care about. A single granite block of several tons was more than a team could drag any real distance over dirt, and it would crush and destroy the soft roads of the day in the trying. This is the reason so many great stoneworks of the era were built right next to their quarries or their water, because moving heavy stone overland was so nearly impossible that builders simply avoided it wherever they could. But the monument could not be moved to the quarry. It had to rise on the hallowed ground of the battle itself, in Charlestown, a dozen miles from the best granite. So the association was trapped between two fixed points: a quarry that could not move, and a sacred site that could not move, with a dozen miles of unforgiving distance between them and thousands of tons of the heaviest building stone on earth to carry across it. Solve that, and you could build the monument. Fail to solve it, and no amount of money or patriotism would raise a single course of stone. Everything hinged on the problem of the 12 miles, and the man who cracked it did not just get the monument built. He accidentally handed the whole country a new way to move the world. And the answer to it, the answer that would end up mattering far more than the monument, came from a builder named Gridley Bryant. Bryant was not a gentleman engineer with a degree. He was a practical, self-taught Massachusetts builder and inventor, a man who solved hard physical problems for a living. And he had already invented a portable derrick, a movable hoisting crane, for lifting heavy loads. Bryant looked at the problem of the granite and proposed something that had never been built in America: a railroad. Not a steam railroad, that was still a novelty even in England, but a railway, a permanent track of rails on which specially built cars, pulled by horses, could roll heavy loads with far less friction than any road allowed. On rails, a horse could pull a load many times greater than it could ever drag through the mud, because the smooth, hard, guided path took the friction and the sinking out of the equation. Bryant designed it, fought through the delays and the doubters and the legal obstacles, got a charter for it in 1826, and built it. Work began in the spring of that year, and by the 7th of October, 1826, the first loaded train of cars rolled over the whole length of the line. They called it the Granite Railway, and it is remembered as the first commercial chartered railroad in the United States. The true beginning of American railroading, and it was built for the sole purpose of hauling the stone for this one monument. I want to give Gridley Bryant his due here, because he is exactly the kind of man this channel exists to remember. Brilliant, practical, largely self-taught, and now mostly forgotten. Bryant had risen by his own ability from ordinary beginnings into a career as a builder and inventor of real distinction, a man who could look at an impossible physical problem and design the machine or the structure that solved it. Building the Granite Railway meant far more than laying some track. Bryant had to work out, largely from first principles and from scattered reports of the early tramways in England, how to build a railway sturdy enough to carry loads heavier than anything a railway had carried before. He designed the heavy stone and timber roadbed, the iron-topped rails, and the specialized cars, including clever devices for loading and turning the massive blocks. He had to win a charter through a doubtful legislature, gaining the right to take the land his line would cross. And he had to overcome the plain skepticism of people who had never seen such a thing and did not believe it would work. When it did work, when that first train of granite rolled the length of the line behind its horses in the autumn of 1826, it was a revelation. People came from far away to see it. This strange new kind of road on which a single horse could move a load that would have taken many teams and destroyed any ordinary road. Engineers studied it closely because it was the clearest demonstration yet on American soil of what rails could do, and much of what Bryant worked out on that granite hauler fed directly into the railroads that would soon explode across the country. He built it to move rock for a monument. What he actually built was the practical foundation of American railroading, and he did it as a means to an end, the end being to get Solomon Willard his granite. The monument would make speeches. Bryant's railway would help make a nation. Before I go on, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click, come back. Because the way that little railway actually worked, and the way the granite was cut and moved, is a piece of pure, practical genius, and it deserves to be understood. Here is how the stone traveled, and every step of it was a solved problem. First, in the quarry, the granite had to be split from the living ledge, and this was done by hand with a technique of beautiful simplicity. The quarrymen would drill a line of holes into the rock, and into each hole they set a pair of curved iron shims, called feathers, with a wedge, called a plug, between them. And then they went down the line striking the plugs, a little on each, again and again. So the pressure built evenly along the whole line until, with a crack, the granite split cleanly along exactly the line the drillers had chosen. Splitting many-ton blocks of the hardest stone with nothing but drilled holes and iron wedges and a careful hand was a real craft, learned over years, and the Quincy quarrymen became masters of it. The Quincy quarries opened up by this project became one of the great granite centers of the world, and the skills the men developed there were remarkable. Splitting granite is not brute force. It is precision applied through patience. The driller had to read the grain of the stone, the subtle planes along which even granite prefers to break, and lay out his line of holes to follow it. The holes had to be bored by hand, one man turning and striking a steel drill, or two men in the practiced, dangerous rhythm of one holding and turning the drill while another swung the sledge, driving the hole deep into some of the hardest rock on earth by main strength and repetition. Then the feathers and plugs went in, and the tapping down the line, and the moment every quarryman lived for, the clean crack running true along the chosen line, splitting off a block of many tons as neatly as if it had been sawn. It was skilled, heavy, dangerous work, done in all weather in the open pit, with the constant hazards of shattering steel and shifting stone and the crushing weight of the blocks themselves. The men who mastered it were craftsmen in the fullest sense, and the granite they cut, once the railway had shown how to move it, went on to build far more than the monument. Quincy granite, and the Quincy men who knew how to work it, supplied stone for buildings and monuments across the whole country for the next 100 years. A major American industry that grew directly out of Solomon Willard's search for the right stone and Gridley Bryant's way of moving it. The monument was the first customer. The industry it seeded was the lasting result. And at the base of that whole industry were the quarrymen, striking their drills down a line in the granite, whose individual names, like the names of the men who built the monument itself, the record almost entirely failed to keep. Then the great blocks, averaging around 2 cubic yards each, had to be lifted onto the rail cars. And here Bryant's derricks did the work, hoisting the stone up and setting it onto the flat platform cars, where chains and ropes lashed it down. The horses pulled the loaded cars along the rails to a point above the Neponset River, and there, because the land dropped away, Bryant built an inclined plane, a steep ramp down which the loaded cars were lowered on a continuous chain, their weight going down helping to haul the empty cars back up. At the bottom, at a wharf on the Neponset, the granite was loaded onto boats and floated around through the water to Charlestown, to the foot of the monument itself. Quarry, to railway, to incline, to boat, to building site. A whole system invented and built from nothing to move stone that no road could carry. And at the Charlestown end, the setting of the stone was its own hard art. The blocks that came off the boats had to be lifted, some of them eventually more than 200 feet up, and set onto the growing tower with enough precision that the great obelisk would rise true and plumb. In the early years, this was done with hoists and derricks worked by hand and by horse, the same family of lifting machines Bryant had helped pioneer, slow and laborious, hauling each block up and swinging it into place by muscle and rope and careful judgment. The setters on top guided each descending block onto its bed, easing it into exact position, a job where a slip or a misjudgment could crush a hand, or worse, working higher and higher into the air as the tower climbed. Every one of the thousands of tons of granite in that shaft was placed by men doing this, block after block, course after course, year after year, first by hand power and later, in the final push, with the help of steam. It was patient, dangerous, exacting work, the unglamorous physical labor at the heart of every great stone structure, and it is exactly the work the finished, gleaming monument makes invisible. You look at the smooth granite obelisk, and you see a single, clean object. You do not see the thousands of separate acts of lifting and setting, each one done by a specific pair of hands that added up to it. It is worth saying a word about why they chose that shape, the plain, tapering, pointed shaft, because it was not obvious and it was fought over. When the association held a competition for the monument's design, they received all sorts of grand and elaborate proposals, columns and towers, and ornate architectural fantasies. But the idea that won out, championed by several of those involved, was the obelisk, the ancient Egyptian form of a tall, slender, four-sided shaft rising to a small pyramid at the top. The obelisk had enormous appeal for a monument like this. It was severe and simple and timeless, free of fashion, carrying an association with the oldest and most enduring monuments human beings had ever made, the obelisks that had stood in Egypt for thousands of years. It said permanence and dignity without ornament, which suited a solemn memorial to sacrifice. And it had the great practical virtue, for a project that would struggle for money, of being relatively plain, a shape whose power came from its scale and its proportion, rather than from expensive carving and sculpture. A tall granite obelisk was about as much monument as you could get for the stone, which mattered enormously to a project that nearly went bankrupt. So the form that rose on Bunker Hill was chosen for its meaning and, quietly, for its economy, an ancient shape pressed into the service of a new nation's memory, and it set a pattern. The obelisk became, after Bunker Hill, one of the standard forms of American public memory, repeated in stone, in countless towns for countless causes, a small architectural legacy of this one long, hard, nearly failed project. One quick note. I turned the full story into a book, everything the records gave me. If you want it, the link is in the description. And yet, with the stone problem brilliantly solved, the monument still almost died. Again and again. And it died of the most ordinary cause there is. It ran out of money. This is the part of the story the triumphant version leaves out, and it is the part I find most human. Building a 200-foot granite obelisk was ruinously expensive, and the money raised in the first burst of patriotic enthusiasm did not last. Construction of the shaft began in 1827, and by the end of 1828, after only about 19 months of building, the association had run out of funds, and the work simply stopped. The half-built stump stood there, a stub of granite going nowhere, for years. Work would lurch forward again for a while, when a bit more money was found, then stop again. For most of the late 1820s and 30s, the great monument to the Revolution was an embarrassing, unfinished stub, and the association was so desperate it even sold off some of its own quarry land to survive. It began to look as though the country might simply fail to finish the thing. I want to slow down on those years of failure, because they are among the truest and least told parts of the story. Picture it. The nation had gathered 100,000 strong to lay the cornerstone with Lafayette and cheer the memory of the Revolution. And then, within a few years, the money was gone, the work had stopped, and the great monument to the founding stood on its hill as a stunted, unfinished stub of granite, going nowhere. It stayed that way, more or less, for the better part of the 1830s. Imagine walking past it in those years, this broken promise in stone, this half-built symbol of a country that could rouse itself to a grand gesture, but could not follow through. The association behind it grew so desperate that it sold off portions of the very quarry land it had bought, cannibalizing the project to keep it barely alive. The grand patriotic enthusiasm of 1825 had curdled into a long, embarrassing failure, and it began to seem genuinely possible that the monument would just stand there forever, a stump, a memorial to good intentions and empty pockets. And the reason I dwell on this is that it makes what happened next so much more meaningful. The monument was not saved by the same grand public enthusiasm that had started it, because that enthusiasm had proven hollow. It was saved by humbler and more stubborn forces. It was saved by women, organized and determined, who ran a fundraising fair with such skill that it brought in a sum large enough to change everything. It was saved by a workingmen's association, ordinary tradesmen who pooled their support to finish what the wealthy patrons had let stall. It was saved by a couple of large private gifts from men who simply decided the thing must not fail. In other words, after the loud and glorious beginning collapsed, the monument was rescued by exactly the kind of quiet, practical, collective effort, much of it by people with little formal power, that actually gets hard things finished in this world. The cornerstone was patriotism. The completion was persistence, and it came from below. What saved it, in the end, was not a rich benefactor or a government grant, though donations helped. What saved it was, in large part, the organized effort of women and the small gifts of working people, and I think that deserves to be said plainly because it so rarely is. In September of 1840, a group of women organized a great fundraising fair in Boston to save the monument, led by figures including Sarah Josepha Hale, the influential editor of a leading ladies' magazine, a woman who understood how to move public sentiment. That fair, run by women at a time when women were allowed almost no formal public or financial power, raised the astonishing sum of over $30,000, a decisive amount that broke the deadlock and made completion possible. Alongside it came key large gifts. A merchant named Amos Lawrence gave $10,000, and another donor, Judah Turo, gave $10,000 more, at first anonymously. And crucial support came from a working men's fraternal group, an association of mechanics and tradesmen, ordinary skilled laborers who organized to help finish a monument the wealthy had let stall. So the granite obelisk that stands today as a symbol of American liberty was rescued from failure by a women's charity fair, an anonymous gift, and the pooled effort of working men, after the grand patriotic enthusiasm of the cornerstone had long since run dry. There is a lesson in that about who actually finishes things. With that money in hand, and with the addition of a powerful steam engine to run the hoisting, the final push came fast. After years of crawling, the monument suddenly leaped upward. In the last stretch, once it was properly funded and the steam derrick was working, well over 100 feet of granite went up in about a single year. The blocks came off the boats at Charlestown, and a steam-powered derrick, its long boom designed by an engineer named James Savage for this final phase, swung each block up the growing tower and set it in place, course by course, 78 courses of granite in all, each course a ring of stone, a bit over 2.5 feet tall. The shaft climbed, narrowing as it rose from 30 feet square at the base toward 15 feet square at the top, with a hollow core up the center holding a spiral stair of 294 steps. And on the 23rd of July, 1842, the last stone, the peak of the pyramid that caps the obelisk, was raised and set, and the tower stood complete at 221 feet, the tallest such monument in the country at the time. The contrast between the crawling early years and that final rush is striking, and it comes down to two things: money and steam. For most of the monument's construction, the lifting had been done by muscle and horse and hand-worked hoists, which is part of why it went so slowly even in the stretches when funds allowed any work at all. But in the final phase, with the fair money in hand, the association could afford a proper steam engine to drive the hoisting, and it changed everything. Steam did not tire, did not need to rest or be fed hay, and could lift a great block far faster than a gang of men and horses working a hand hoist. With a steam derrick swinging block after block up the tower, and enough money to keep the stone flowing off Bryant's Railway and the boats, the monument that had crept upward by fits and starts for over a decade suddenly surged, rising well over 100 feet in roughly a single year, a rate that would have seemed impossible in the lean times. Inside the rising shaft, they built the spiral staircase that visitors still climb. 294 stone steps winding up the hollow core in the dark to a small chamber near the top, with windows looking out over Boston and the harbor and the very ground where the battle had been fought. To stand up there, when it was finished, was to look down from more than 200 feet on the whole landscape of the Revolution's opening act, a view no one had ever had before, made possible by all that granite and all those hands. The long years of failure had made the final speed feel almost like a miracle. It was not a miracle. It was money and steam and skilled men, finally all present at once, doing in a year what poverty had prevented for a decade. I have to pause here on a single human fact, because it is almost the only trace we have of the workers as individuals. In all those years of splitting and hauling and hoisting many-ton blocks of granite, of men working at height on a rising stone tower with the tools of the 1820s, only one workman is recorded to have died building the Bunker Hill Monument. He fell to his death when the tower had reached about 40 feet. That is all the record gives me. One man, one fall, at 40 feet. Not his name, not his age, not whether he had a family waiting or where he was buried, or what the men working beside him did when he hit the ground. Just the bare fact of him, one death, folded into the construction history like a line item, and I find that I cannot get past it, because that one nameless man is standing in for all of them, all the quarrymen and teamsters and setters whose skill and sweat raised this thing, and whose names the celebration did not bother to keep. He fell at 40 feet. The monument went on up to 221, and we do not know who he was. I have gone looking for him, that one man, in the records I could find, and he simply is not there as a person. The construction accounts note the fact of a fatal fall, the way they might note a delay from bad weather or a shipment of stone, a thing to be recorded and moved past. But the man himself, his name, his story, the whole his death left in some family, is gone, dissolved into that single line. And here is the thing that stays with me. He is only in the record at all because he died. The men who did the same dangerous work and did not fall, who split the granite and rode the railway and set the courses and went home each night and came back each morning for 18 years, are not in the record even that much. They did not die spectacularly enough to be noted. They simply worked and were paid and were forgotten. So this one anonymous falling man is, in a strange way, the representative of all of them, the single visible point of an enormous mass of invisible labor. When I climb the monument, I think of him partway up that story, and then I think of all the others he stands for, the ones who did not fall, and so left no mark at all. The granite remembers none of them by name, but the granite is them. Every block of it passed through their hands. The dedication, when it finally came, was one of the great public events of the age. On the 17th of June, 1843, 18 years to the day after Lafayette had laid the cornerstone, and 68 years after the battle itself, the finished monument was dedicated before an enormous crowd. The President of the United States, John Tyler, attended with his cabinet. And most movingly, a small number of actual survivors of the Revolution, ancient men now, were there to see it, a last handful of the generation the monument honored. The great orator Daniel Webster delivered the address, as he had at the cornerstone 18 years before, his voice rolling out over the multitude, consecrating the finished obelisk to the memory of the men who had fought on that ground. It was the emotional capstone to a generation's effort, the moment the long, troubled, nearly failed project became, at last, a triumph. And the speeches, naturally, were about the heroes of the battle, and about liberty, and about the glory of the nation, as they should have been. But standing in that crowd, invisible in it, were the men who had actually built the thing being dedicated. The quarrymen, and the teamsters, and the men who had run the little railway, and not one word of those speeches was about them. That dedication was, by any measure, a magnificent moment, and I do not begrudge it its glory, because the thing being honored deserved honoring. Daniel Webster was perhaps the greatest orator of his American generation, and he had spoken at the cornerstone 18 years earlier, so for him to return and speak again at the completion closed a perfect circle, his voice rolling out over a vast crowd to consecrate the finished tower to the men of 1775. The presence of the president and his cabinet gave it the full weight of the nation. But the detail that moves me most is the handful of actual revolutionary survivors who were brought to see it. A few ancient men, the last living remnant of the generation the monument was racing to remember before they were gone. They had been young men on that hill, or in that war, and now they sat, white-haired and frail, at the foot of a 200-foot granite tower raised in their honor, watching a country that had been a struggling infant in their youth stand as a confident nation. For them, the monument was not history. It was their own lives, turned to stone while they still breathed. That the builders were forgotten in the speeches is a real omission, and I have spent this whole video insisting on it. But I can also hold, at the same time, the genuine and earned emotion of that day, the last veterans and the great orator and the finished tower, the memory caught in granite just in time. Both things are true. It was a triumph of remembering. It just remembered some people and forgot others the way, I am afraid, remembering almost always does. Here's the part of the legacy that still amazes me, though, and it is why I started where I did. The monument is beautiful and it is meaningful, but in the long run, it is not the most important thing that came out of this project. The most important thing was the railroad. That little granite railway, thrown together by Gridley Bryant to solve the specific problem of hauling this specific stone, was the seed of the entire American railroad system. It proved, on American ground, that rails could move heavy loads in ways roads never could. Engineers came to study it. Its methods and its hardware fed directly into the railroads that began to spread across the country in the following years and decades. The railroads that would knit the continent together, win and lose wars, build cities, and utterly transform American life. All of that traces back in part to a horse-drawn granite hauler built to carry rock for a war memorial. The monument was the goal. The railway was the accident that changed everything. And the Quincy granite that the railway was built to move went on to become one of the great building stones of the nation, quarried for another century and shipped all over the country to build banks and courthouses and monuments. A whole industry that Solomon Willard's search for the right stone had opened up. This one troubled project to honor one old battle ended up launching both the American granite industry and the American railroad almost as side effects. I keep turning that over, because it is such a strange and wonderful shape for history to take. A group of people set out to do one thing, to build a monument, and in the course of solving the practical problems in their way, they accidentally did two much larger things that they never set out to do at all. They needed to move heavy stone, so a man invented the American railroad. They needed good granite, so a man opened up an industry that would clad the country in stone for a century. The intended achievement, the monument, is a fine and moving thing, but it is dwarfed, in its actual consequences, by the tools that were invented merely to build it. And there is something very true to how progress actually works in that. The big, planned, celebrated projects are often less important in the long run than the humble problem-solving they force along the way. The Granite Railway was not the point. It was the means. And the means outgrew the end so completely that today the railroad it fathered has remade the entire world, while the monument it was built to serve stands quietly on its hill, visited by tourists who mostly have no idea that the first railroad in America once ran to fetch its stones. The workers who built both the railway and the monument would probably be astonished to learn which one turned out to matter more. When I climb the 294 steps up the inside of that obelisk today, up through the cool dark of the hollow granite shaft, I think about all the hands it took. Lafayette and Webster and the presidents get the plaques. Willard and Bryant, the architect and the railway builder, at least kept their names, and they earned them. But the men I think about are the ones in the Quincy quarry, striking the plugs down a line of drilled holes until the granite cracked clean, and the teamsters walking their horses along Bryant's rails with tons of stone rolling behind them, and the men on the boats and the men at the derricks in Charlestown setting course after course of granite into the sky. And I think about the one who fell at 40 feet, the single one of them the record noticed, and only because he died. They built the first railroad in America and the first great monument to the Revolution. And they did it by hand, with wedges and horses and rope and steam, and the country dedicated the result to the memory of heroes and forgot the men standing right there, who had made it. The granite still stands, every hand-split block of it. The little railway that hauled it changed the world. And under all of it, unnamed, are the workers, holding up, as they always do, the thing that everyone else takes the credit for. If you go to Boston, you can climb it yourself, all 294 steps, up through the cool granite dark, and stand where the last stone was set, and look out over the harbor and the city. And if you go a little south, to Quincy, you can find the traces of the old Granite Railway, the first railroad in America, marked now as the historic thing it was, running from the quarry that gave up the stone. Standing in either place, you are standing inside the work of those forgotten men, the quarrymen and the teamsters and the setters and the one who fell. They left us two gifts, really. A monument that caught the memory of a great battle in stone before the men who had fought it were gone, and, entirely by accident, the railroad, which would go on to remake the whole country. They got no credit for either. They just did the work, split the stone, laid the rails, set the courses, and handed the results to a nation that carved other men's names on the plaques. The least we can do, climbing their monument or walking their railway, is to know they were there, and to say so out loud, because they were there. All of it, every block and every rail, passed through their hands first, long before it ever passed into anybody's memory. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss Tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.